Hello and good morning. This is Jill Florent. I'm happy to welcome you to the QuickSight Fall Learning Series. Today we are going to be led by Arun Santosh, who is our worldwide QuickSight Specialist Solutions Architect. My name is Jill Florent, and I am the Customer Success Manager for the QuickSight team. I'm just going to go through a couple of background details here to help orient you to make sure you're in the right place. We are going to be focused today on a developer experience. So we're going to dive deep on user-based embedding with QuickSight. I just wanted to remind you that there are a couple of prerequisites here. We're expecting this to be a really in-depth, hands-on session. You should have a little bit of background with QuickSight, potentially having attended our author workshop, but today we're going to be diving into the administrator experience. So you're going to want to have an enterprise account with admin privileges and a basic understanding of JavaScript and Python. So hopefully you're feeling like you're in the right place. I did want to call out that we are going to be answering questions to the best of our ability. So if you look at the control panel that you have on the right side of your screen, you will see that there's a place where we can have chat. So I'll be sharing with you in a moment a link to some of the materials that we'll be working with today. And we'll be happy to take your questions with the, we have a couple of moderators here who will be answering questions as we go through. One of the other key callouts is that we are going to be recording the session today and sharing the workshop on our QuickSight YouTube channel. And we do expect to have that link posted by the end of the week. Take it away, Arun.
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Arun Santosh, Senior Solution Architect, QuickSight. I'll be taking you through the user-based embedding workshop today. And let me just get the slide deck up here. So in terms of agenda, what we'll be doing here today is getting to know the new embedding API. And then we will quickly look through the architecture that we'll be building today, and followed by live workshop thereafter. So we wouldn't spend much time on slides at all. We'll be doing hands-on. With that, let's get into the meat of it. So far, we had two get versions of these APIs to work with when embedding. So we will look at get QuickSight help. We used to use these get dashboard embed URL and get session embed URL, these two up here. The dashboard embed URL was used to generate the dynamic embed URLs for dashboards. Session embed URLs was to generate the active sessions, be it reader sessions or author sessions. Now, the new API we have put out is generate embed URL for registered user. And this one sort of encompasses all the capabilities. So you can use the generate embed URL for registered user to create embed URLs for both your dashboards and sessions. And in the near future, you'll also be able to do this for Q. So we will take a quick look at how to do this right from the CLI here. And then we will talk about an architecture to wrap this all in, and we will get into building that. But basics first, so we'll get into using this API to generate an embed URL. So let's do that. AWS QuickSight, generate embed URL for registered user. And in here, we need to provide the AWS account ID. And we need a user ARN. And that's the standard format. So it's ARN, AWS, QuickSight, followed by the region, identity region that is. So that's US East one for me. And then my account number. I have that stored into a variable. So that's why I'm typing in this $AAI. I did the same here. You have to actually supply the full account number. And then the format is user / your namespace. So that's default in my case here. And then your username. So that I'm using an SSO backed federated identity. So I am going to give my role name followed by my username here. God. Okay. And next part of it is the experience configuration. Therein, if we are doing this for a dashboard, the shorthand is we could type in dashboard equal to, and then we have to specify the initial dashboard ID. So let's do that. And then equal to, I have to grab a dashboard ID. So let me quickly go on to my QuickSight instance here. And let's pick this test dashboard, grab the dashboard ID from here, and paste that in. So you can see the output of this particular API call is a URL. And this URL is what we can use to launch this dashboard. So let's try redeeming that here. You can see that the dashboard is coming up for me. So it's this principle that we will use for embedding, and all the new features with embedding will be getting added to this generate embed URL variant, right? So there is one for registered user, there is one for anonymous user. Today's workshop will be focusing on the registered user variant. And if we have to generate the QuickSight embedded session, what we would do instead here is, instead of the dashboard, we will specify this as QuickSight console. And then instead of initial dashboard ID, we would say initial path. And then we would provide the path therein. So let's say we want to start with /start/ favorites. We could do like that. And it would give us the URL for an embedded session that will open up to the favorites folder. Or if we want to embed queue going forward, and this embedding of queue is a preview feature right now, so I will call that out. If you have queue enabled on your account, you would still need to have your account allow listed for queue embedding for this piece to work right now. So I could do queue search as the initial path, and the URL that it brings back for me would be for a queue bar that opens up in the browser or in an embedded iframe. So with that, let's next look at the architecture that we will be building today. So we will be doing a minimal architecture wherein we are having an OpenID Connect SSO source mapped into IAM as an identity provider, and we will use Cognito to play the part of this OpenID identity provider here. When you're building at your end, you could use any identity provider of your choice. You could use an OpenID Connect variant. You could use SAML-backed identity providers, or it could be something homegrown, just as simple as a database table with your usernames and passwords. As you saw in the API call I made, we are passing in the full user ARN to QuickSight. So as long as your parent application or parent web page knows for sure who the user is and can construct that user ARN using that fixed format that we have, that's all that matters. You can then connect and generate those embed URLs from QuickSight. So now let's see, in this particular sample, we will use API gateway and Lambda combination to serve out a static web page. You could do this from your own web server, or you could use a S3 CloudFront combination to do this, serving out a static web page. We are doing this using API gateway and Lambda just to keep things simple, to make this work with minimal set of components. So the user makes the call, gets back the static web page that loads on the browser. And at this point, we check whether the user is already signed into Cognito or not. And there are different ways you could do this check, and it depends on your identity provider. Some would give you standard functions to call, which would do this check for you and then route you to the identity provider sign-in page if the user is not already signed in. In some cases, you will have to check for cookies on the browser session, so on and so forth. So here we'll be looking for a cookie, and if that cookie doesn't exist, then we will send the user to the Cognito sign-in page. The user signs in there with the credentials and then is returned back to that static web page. This time around, since the OpenID token is available, the user can proceed on to the next step. That's making another API gateway call. And in here, we invoke Lambda, and Lambda now gets that OpenID token being passed in. And it would make an AWS STS call to assume a role that we linked with the Cognito identity provider. Now, this particular role will create as part of this framework. It will be a dummy role. We are not going to give it any permissions as such. We'll use that role to register the user in that role/session name combination that I showed you earlier. And then we will use that into the user ARN, but that role itself doesn't have any permissions. So the AWS STS call to assume that role, all it's doing is validating that OpenID token for us. We are just relying on that STS layer to do that. But the credentials returned from assuming that role, we are not going to necessarily use that, because we will, and successful STS call is all we need. At that point, we know that the token is valid. So in our code block, we will construct the user ARN and then proceed with the same role that Lambda is running under. Okay. So once the successful STS call is made, Lambda knows that the user token is valid, OpenID token is valid, and can proceed further. So we make API calls to QuickSight at this point, and this would be we will make multiple calls as part of this flow. In a regular embedding flow, the generate embed URL for registered user, that's the API you'll be calling. As part of this workshop, for the very first time when a user is going in, we will be doing just-in-time provisioning. So we are making additional calls to register that user, create a group, create group membership for that user. All that is just to make this flow easier for us while we try to get familiar with the embedding aspect of QuickSight. When you're building your own application, the recommendation by all means is to pre-register the user as part of your application user onboarding if possible. That way, when the user is coming to consume a dashboard, we don't make that user wait few more seconds in registering the user and doing those group additions, right? But let's say for whatever reason you're not able to pre-register your user due to some constraints at your application side. All good, you can still do just-in-time provisioning like we are doing here. Only reason I called it out that it's a recommendation to do it ahead of time is that it saves few seconds for the very first time when a user is coming to consume a dashboard. Subsequent iterations, it doesn't matter. So in here, we make that, let's say we are making the embedded URL call here, the generate embed URL for registered user. QuickSight returns that URL, and then it gets passed back to the front-end browser. We have provided JavaScript libraries for QuickSight embedding. So that's included in the front-end code, and that lets you embed this URL by just making a call to the embed dashboard or embed session function therein, passing in this URL, as well as a div identified for embedding this URL. So once you make the call to that function, it embeds that dynamic URL into that div, and content is directly pulled in from QuickSight and displayed on the browser. So that's the flow we'll be building today. So let's get into it, and I'll also show you the, let's see, also show you the workshop that I'll be using today. So learn QuickSight workshop.aws. The link should have been included in the invite. If not, Jill or one of the moderators kindly drop this into chat. The user-based embedding workshop is what we will be building hands-on today. Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds to bring that up, and then we will get going. Okay, so in here, as part of the prerequisites, what we will need to complete this workshop is an AWS account with admin rights. We will need a QuickSight enterprise account and basic understanding of JavaScript and Python. Don't worry if you're just getting started in JavaScript and Python. We provide all the code you would need here, and you will be just fine following the instructions. But it helps to have an understanding of JavaScript and Python. And to start off, let's create a copy of this embedding notes template. So let's copy this and save that into a file at your end. We'll just put this into a new file at my side as well. And let me just save this to desktop, user-based embedding, and embedding notes. It's a simple step, but kindly do this. Kindly have this in a notepad at your end if you're following along with me, building your own version of this. because we are building multiple components and we need to reference the user pool ID, client ID, domain URL, so on and so forth. These are generated from different steps of the process rather than flipping back and forth on the console trying to find those values. It helps a lot having that in a notepad for easy reference. Okay, so I hope you all have got this in a notepad and ready to go. Let me just maximize this window here as well. Okay, so we'll get started. The first step in our process is to set up QuickSight. If you do not already have QuickSight set up, all of you are QuickSight users if you're here, so most likely you have your own QuickSight account. But let's say you're doing this on a personal account, I'll just walk you through that process as well. So what I did is just search for QuickSight from the AWS console services panel, and this is a fresh account I'm using. I'm not signed into, haven't signed up for QuickSight, so it brings me to the sign up screen. So if you got the same, just go ahead and click sign up for QuickSight. For folks who already have QuickSight set up and available, kindly bear with me. Just watch through these steps because some of the sign up flow has changed as well, so it might be a refresher for you. So with addition of Q, now the two options we have are Enterprise and Enterprise plus Q. For purposes of this workshop, it's okay to go with Enterprise. You can explore Q later on, and Q can always be added on top of the Enterprise version. So no worries about selecting Enterprise and moving forward. Okay, so I'm keeping that selection at Enterprise and clicking continue. In the next screen, I have to select the authentication method. So we have three options: IAM federated identities and QuickSight managed users, where we also, in addition to that federated identity, we get to use QuickSight internal identities. This is useful if you want to just invite somebody based on their email to come use your system and consume analytics that you have shared with them. But for security reasons, if that's not preferred, then go with IAM federated identities only. So this is just the SSO option. You will not have QuickSight internal identities created. Or if you're hooking up Active Directory, then you would use this. But for purposes of this workshop, we want to use the federated identity option. So I would leave it at the first one, but if you want to choose the second option, that's fine as well. Choose one of the top two. Then we got to select a region. This region has got a couple of significances here. I will leave this at US North Virginia. This is where your spice capacity will be allocated. So for each author that you create in QuickSight, you get 10 GB of free spice. That's our internal data storage. And all that will be allocated to the region you select here. Plus, if you're also enabling Q, if you're using Enterprise plus Q version, then the region you select here is where your initial Q would be enabled as well, because that's a regional service. It has to be enabled per region. Now for QuickSight account name, you can give a name that makes sense to you. And keep in mind that it stays for the entire life of your account. It should be something that's meaningful to your entire user population as well. So in my case, I'm just going to put in QSWS for QS workshop because this is a temp account that I'll be blowing away. But in your case, use a meaningful name. And since I create way too many of these, I am just making it unique with the date timestamp as well. Also, missed mentioning something else here. There is one more significance to the selection you make here in the region. In addition to the two that I mentioned, it also has a bearing on your identity region. So based on the region you select here, the closest region to that selected one, which is equipped to manage identities, would be used to manage your identities. So all your groups, QuickSight groups and QuickSight users would be managed in that region. Now for email address, put in your official email address. And then the rest of the settings here is all good. And you can click on finish. And it would create your QuickSight account. This takes anywhere between 15 to 30 seconds to go through. And then we will be able to get into the QuickSight console. So while that's happening, let's create a new tab as well. Okay, just completed at my end, so I might as well finish this step. So I'll click on Go to Amazon QuickSight button, and it will launch QuickSight console for me and set up some samples. Okay, and we are in QuickSight. Now let's open a new tab in the same window. So you're connected to the same, you can easily get onto the same AWS account. So open up console AWS Amazon.com, separate tab in the same window. Ensure that you're staying in the same account, same region. And then we will start building components of that architecture that we looked at. So first step herein, as part of the framework, we will build a Cognito user pool. So let's do that. And we'll start by searching for the service Cognito here in the services search, and then select Cognito from under services. In here on the welcome screen, choose the option to manage user pools. And we do not have any user pools created so far, so I'm coming to an empty screen. And then there's this button top right which says create a user pool. So let's go ahead and click that. And we need a pool name here. So for all the assets that I create, or almost all the assets that I create here as part of this framework, I'll be using the same name, QS embed sample, just to keep things together. So when we come back and look at this, we know it's all created for this embedding sample. Okay. So I gave the name as QS embed sample, if you're seeing my screen. And then we can click on the step through settings button down below that. And in here, on the attribute screen, we want to uncheck this option which says enable case insensitivity for username input. Even though it says recommended, let's uncheck that. That's because usernames are case sensitive in QuickSight. And if we keep this checked, Cognito is going to translate everything to lowercase. We don't want that happening. So let's deselect that and then scroll down, click on next step. And in here, we have the choice whether to allow the users to sign up or only allow admins to create users. Since we are doing this just for demoing this QuickSight embedding and just for our own learning purposes, let's flip this over to use only allow administrators to create users. We don't want anybody else getting a hold of that URL, signing up themselves and creating, translating to QuickSight users there, right? So select only allow administrators to create users and click on next step. Now, next few screens, we can just scroll down and just keep skipping on to the next step. Keep doing that till you get to the app clients page. Don't skip past that. Okay, so I skipped MFA and verifications, skipping message customization. I'm skipping tags and devices. And now I'm on app clients. So hold it there. I'll just give you a few seconds for the folks who are following along. And herein we have this link which says add an app client. So go ahead and click on that one. It asks for an app client name. Again, we will use the same name. So QS embed sample is what we will put in here. And just scroll down to auth flow configuration and check all the boxes therein. So there were two that were not checked. Allow admin user password auth and allow user password auth. Enable those as well. And we're doing this because we want to use the simple authentication flow here, wherein we just sign in on to Cognito with username and password, and we get back the OpenID token directly returned on the redirect to that static page. So enable all auth flows, and then scroll down and be cautious here. Don't click on next step. We want to click on create app client. So be sure to click on create app client button. And you will get a message that the app client ID and secret will be available after you save this user pool. So be sure you see that message, and then you can click on next step to move along. We won't be configuring any triggers, so just scroll down on that triggers page, click next, and that will bring you to the review section. Just look through it, make sure that we have the app client name showing up there, and then we can click on the create pool button at the bottom. So you should see a message which says your user pool was created successfully, and at the top of that page you will have a pool ID. So let's copy this pool ID and let's save that into our embedding notepad as the Cognito user pool ID. Okay. And at this point, let's also capture the AWS account ID we are working with. You can get that from the console. You can stay on the same Cognito page, just click on where it says your username, and then you can grab the account number from where it says my account. Now let's paste that into the notepad as well as the first entry, AWS account ID. Be sure to keep saving your notepad as we go along. Now, the next step herein, let's click on the app client setting page, which is from the left panel under app integration section, the first option, app client setting. And herein on the top, you will see the app client name is QS embed sample, and the line underneath that, it gives the ID. So app client ID, let's copy that and save that into our notepad as the Cognito client ID. Now come back to the Cognito page, and in here, let's do some configurations. So the first thing we'll do is enable identity provider. Let's select this select all checkbox. So it checks the Cognito user pool as an allowed identity provider for this app client. And for the callback URL, we want to put in a dummy value right now. Eventually, what we really want here is the static page URL from which we are making this call to this app client, and the static page to which we want it returned, right? And so we do not have that created yet. We don't have that URL handy yet. So what we can do is just trick Cognito into letting us proceed by putting a dummy URL, and that's provided in the fifth step of the Cognito user pool section of the workshop. So just copy that from there, paste https://dummy into both callback URL and sign out URL in here. And once that's done, let's go into the auth section In the allowed auth flow, you want to select implicit grant. And in the auth scope, let's select the OpenID and the profile. With that done, I'll just repeat those selections. So auth flow, implicit grant, auth scope, we want to select the OpenID and profile. Okay, so with that done, let's click on Save Changes. Just make sure that the selections you made are sticking. And then let's go on to choosing a domain name. So at the bottom of the page, you have the option bottom right, choose domain name. Click on that. And it brings you to this Cognito domain configuration. So as part of the domain name, let's just use the convention here as QSES for QS embed sample, short for QS embed sample. And then let's ensure that that domain name is available by using our account number to make it unique, right? So let's copy the account number from the notepad and paste that in here. So we are typing in QSES followed by our account number into this domain prefix, and let's click on the check availability button. It says that the domain is available. Just in case you're hitting a domain unavailable error, make sure you could just add another digit at the end of your account number. Just be sure to make a note of it, right? And with that, you can save changes here. And let's copy this full URL. Just because this center part is turned out, it will not copy through correctly, but let's still copy this full URL here and paste that into the notepad, and then we'll fix it there. So paste it against the Cognito domain URL, and you'll see it didn't get that stoned out portion, but that's fine. We know what we entered there. It was QSES and followed by the account number. So we have that right here. Let's paste that again in here and get this fixed up. Okay, so it should be https://QSES followed by your account number, auth.auth.yourregion.amazoncognito.com. Okay, let's make sure we have that in the notepad correctly and save it. Now we'll do one more step here, and that's creating a user. So for that, click on users and groups from left panel under the general settings. And in the users panel that opens up, click the create user button. Therein, give the username as demo user. You can please refer the workshop and copy the demo user with a caps D and a caps U, the same way as it's given in the workshop. Paste that in, and there are other values that's specified here, the invite by email option. And if you're doing this at your end, you could use a different password, but be sure to note it down because we don't want you forgetting the password when we come back to the final step of signing in, right? So be sure to jot it down. So in my case, I will for now just use this password. Oops. We don't necessarily need the phone number. Let's leave that and mark the email as verified. Plug in an email there. Anytime you want to reset your password, this email is important, so be sure to put in an email that you have access to. Okay. And let me I'm paranoid when it comes to the passwords. So let me make sure I'm typing that in right. In fact, let's paste this again. Don't want any typos causing me trouble at the end. Okay. And let's click, and in the send invitation to the new user, you could select the email option therein. So I have the demo user at the username, I have email invite, I have a temporary password set up, phone, I haven't put anything, I have unchecked the marked phone number as verified, given my email and marked email as verified. With that, I'll click create user. So you should see the user getting created here. And with that, we complete that first step of creating a identity provider user pool using Cognito. And now we can proceed on to the next step in the workshop, which is mapping it in IAM as an identity provider. Okay. So for that, let's open a new tab, and therein let's open console, and then go on to search for IAM. And once the IAM console opens up, from the left panel, you can select identity providers. And therein, you have this option to add a provider on the right-hand side of your screen. So go ahead and click the Add Provider button there. It brings you to this identity provider configuration screen. You have the choice between SAML and OpenID Connect. In our case, we are going to use OpenID Connect. So let's go ahead and select that option. And then it asks us for a provider URL. So that's given in this workshop, step 2. So step 2 under IAM identity provider, there is this URL given. And note that there are two parts of this URL in italics: the region of the user pool and the Cognito user pool ID. So we want to replace both of this when we are pasting this into the IAM configuration screen. So I'll copy this over. And the provider URL starts with an HTTPS. Be sure to clear it so we don't end up with two HTTPS in there, right? And then region of user pool. I am building this in US East 1, so I'll type in US-East-1. And then the last part of it where it says Cognito user pool ID, let's replace that with our user pool ID, which we have saved in the embedding notepad. And that's the shorter of the two. We saved the user pool ID and the client ID. Be sure to pick the user pool ID. It would start with the region where you're working on, right? So, and paste that at the end of the URL. Once that's done, click on this Get Thumbprint button. And if your URL is correctly formed, you should see a verification message, which gives you the validity going up to 2034. If you see that, then we are good to proceed. If not, verify your URL and try again. And under audience, we want to plug in the Cognito client ID. So let's select that app client ID, which we have saved in the notepad, and put that under the audience. With that done, let's scroll down and click on Add Provider. You should see a success message, and you should see that provider being created here. Now we are good to move on to the step of creating roles. So we'll first create the web identity role that works with this identity provider. And this is the one which I mentioned we'll create without permissions. And we are going to call it as QSER, short for QuickSight Embedding role, right? So we'll do that next. So flipping back to the IAM console, let's click on roles from left panel and choose to create a new role. So click the create role button from right. And therein we have the option of trusted entities, AWS service, another account, web identity, or SAML federation. We are creating the web identity based role. So let's select web identity as the trusted entity there, meaning whoever is coming and using that IAM identity provider will be allowed to assume this role. And you will see the bottoms panel of that screen change when you select web identity as the trusted entity. And from the identity provider, select the cognitive IDP, which we just now created. If you're having multiple IDPs, be sure to cross-check that you're picking the one with the correct user pool ID. So cross-check the user pool ID at the end of it and ensure you're picking the correct one. Once you select the identity provider, it will give you an audience dropdown. We just have one app client ID configured there. So that's what will show up in the dropdown. Just select that and click on Next Permissions button at the bottom of the screen. In here, we are not going to attach any policies, so just keep going. Click Next Tags, Next Review, and for the role name, like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to type in QSER in caps for QuickSight Embedding role. And this becomes part of your QuickSight username. So it's a role name / session name that gets registered into QuickSight. So in our case, we set up a user as demo user in Cognito, and then we are setting up this role to work with that. So the way this user is going to get registered into QuickSight is QSER / demo user. So when you're creating your own setup, be sure to pick a role that's meaningful to you, but keep it short if possible. If you have a really long role name, it's going to take up most of the display when you're looking at it from the user listing from the QuickSight management console. You might not see the relevant part of the username because your role name is too long, right? So keep it short to medium for that purpose. Okay, so I just plugged in the role name as QSER, and I'll go ahead and click Create Role. I get the confirmation message that the role has been successfully created. You can verify that by just searching here as well, and for sure the role shows up. Let's click into that role and we will grab the role ARN for saving into our notepad. So I opened up the role summary page, and from there, the top section, I'm copying the role ARN and pasting that into my notepad against role ARN. In here, just take a quick peek at the trust relationship. So this is what we accomplished by selecting the web identity as the trusted entity when we set up this role. So that association has been made under trust relationship, right? And now we can move on to the next role creation, which will be for our Lambda. So Lambda execution role, we'll start off by creating a policy this time, because this one we need to have permissions provided. So flipping back to the IAM console, let's click on policies from left panel and choose to create a new policy by clicking the create policy button from top right. Therein we get the visual editor as well as the JSON option. So let's go with the JSON tab. So click on the tab where it says JSON. There is a template in here. Just select that and delete it. Now that your JSON editor screen is blank, come on to the workshop page, and under Lambda execution role section, step 2, we have provided a sample policy. So go ahead and copy that policy, and let's paste that into this JSON editor. So what we are providing permissions for this Lambda role to do, this policy to allow the Lambda role to do, we'll make that association in the next step, is the capability to call generate embed URL for registered user. This obviously is the one which we looked at earlier to generate those dynamic URLs. And as part of building the sample application, we are also going to give you a list of dashboards that the user has got access to. So towards that end, we also give the option to describe dashboard, and then we want to allow for that user to be registered in real time when you're logging in for the very first time. So for that purpose, we are having the register user, describe user, create group, and create group membership allowed, and then logging, of course. So with that, let's click on next tags button here and go on to create this policy. As for the policy name, you could pick the policy name to be used from step 4. So just copy that over. QS embed policy is what we are calling this. Put that into the name box there. Confirm that you're seeing this CloudWatch log and QuickSight permissions under summary, and then click on create policy button. Should get a confirmation that the QS embed policy has been created. Just search for it to be sure, and it comes up in this listing. So next we can create a role and associate this policy with that role. So for that, from left hand side, click on roles and choose to create a role by clicking this create role button from top right. This time round, we want to select Lambda as a trusted entity. So the AWS service, and then the use case is Lambda. Make those selections, AWS service, and in the choose a use case, select Lambda, and then click next permissions. And herein, search for QS embed policy. Click the checkbox against that policy and click on next tags and next review. And for the name, you can again copy that from the workshop. We are going to call it QS embed role. That's again given in step 4 of the workshop. So let's plug in that role name here. Ensure that QS embed policy is showing up under the policies section of that review page. And then you're good to click create role, get this created. Okay, so I got the confirmation that QS embed role has been created. Now we are good to move on to the next step, which is creating our Lambda layer. So for that, let's open a new tab and launch console again. And herein, let's search for Lambda from the services search up top, and choose Lambda that shows up under services in that dropdown. Now, we are choosing Lambda to keep things simple. We don't want to stand up a server just for this application. Lambda is very suitable for this kind of setup. We will use that Lambda API gateway combination both as our initial web server, which serves out static HTML, and then later on in subsequent API calls that's made to register the user, generate the embed URL, and so on. Right. So once you're on the Lambda page, go ahead and click the create function button from top right, and on that create function screen, leave the top choice as author from scratch. And for the function name, again, we'll stick with the same naming convention. We'll just type in QS embed sample here as the name of this function. And then for runtime, instead of Node.js, let's select Python 3.8. So click that drop down and select Python 3.8. Architecture, you can leave it at default. And under permissions, open up the twisty which says change default execution role. Therein, you have a choice to use an existing role. So go ahead and select that radio button. And then from existing roles, click the drop down and choose QS embed role, which we created in the last step. So I'll just repeat those choices. Function name, I plugged in QS embed sample. Runtime, I put in Python 3.8. Architecture, I left it at x86 default. And under execution role, I chose to use an existing role and selected QS embed role. With that, let's click on the create function button from the bottom of the page. And that lands us into this function overview page, and the code source is open at the bottom. So what I want you to do next is go on to the workshop page, click on Web Content Lambda, and in the step 2 therein, there is this option to download a Lambda package. So go ahead and download that to your local. I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then we will be uploading that into this Lambda function. Okay, so you should have downloaded it by now. Let's keep going. Back on the Lambda function page, in the code source section, to the right, there is an upload from button. So click on that and you will get a drop down. And from there, choose the .zip file option and choose to upload the file. And you can pick up the zip file that you just now downloaded. And then click on the save button in that pop-up. So it should load a QS embed sample folder for you with some subfolders. So it's content, optional packages, QuickSight, and then a couple of py files and a readme file. Okay, so let's quickly go through the readme here. If you double click that, I'll just call out the main things to note here. Now this is a sample code package. The intent is to help you get familiarized with QuickSight embedding. Don't blindly use this in your production context. Always consider your production requirements and tweak it or modify it as you best deem fit. As part of this workflow, we are registering user real time, creating a group, adding the user to those groups. All that is happening real time. But when you're doing it, if possible, do it ahead of time as part of your application user onboarding, like I mentioned earlier. If that's not possible, then it's just a few extra seconds, so it doesn't matter much. So you can do just-in-time provisioning as well. And as part of this code block, I have given a couple more capabilities which are not turned on by default. But if you want to do queue embedding or do local token validation, there is provision to do that as well, just by adding additional environment variables. We will look at that code once we have finished this setup. So just wanted to call that out at the beginning. And now we can move on to the next step in here, which is configuring the environment runtime as well as environment variables for this Lambda function. So for that, let's click on this configuration tab up top, and therein under general configuration, let's click on edit. The timeout by default that Lambda sets up is 3 seconds. We want to give it a little bit more time, so let's make this 30 seconds instead. 30 seconds is what API Gateway would wait for you max. So let's set it at 30 seconds. You can go up to 15 minutes with Lambda for other use cases, but in our case, we are always returning the response through API Gateway, so I'm setting it at 30 seconds. With that, let's click on Save. And next, let's click Environment Variables from the left panel. And we want to create a bunch of environment variables in here. Refer the workshop again. And this would be under step 5 within Web Content Lambda. So we want to create these 5 environment variables, and values of the first 3 are available in our notepad. For dashboard region, we want to plug in a region from where we want to pick a dashboard for embedding. And for AWS data path, we will just be putting the value as a single dot. And I'll talk more about that as we get there. But be sure to just copy these variable names from the workshop so we don't end up with any typos or any incorrect case with the letters and run into unwanted trouble, right? So just copy the environment variables as given in step 5 of the workshop, and let's create those environment variables. So back on the Lambda environment variable section, clicking on edit button, and therein click add environment variable. And as the key, I'm first pasting in the Cognito client ID, and then I'll go get the client ID. And that's the reminder, the longer of the 2 values, not the user pool, but the client ID is what we are first creating. Next one would be the Cognito domain URL. And that's also in our notepad. The full URL with starting with HTTPS, going all the way to amazoncognito.com. That's what we want to plug into the value there. Next one is the role ARN. That again is in our notepad, the QSER roles ARN. So let's paste that in. The next value is the dashboard region. I just set up my QuickSight account in this temporary AWS account, and the samples were created in the US East 1. So I'm going to use US East 1 at my end. If you're having a different region in mind, be sure to put that in here. And the final environment variable we'll add is AWS data path, AWS underscore data underscore path. And the value for that, just put in a single dot or a period character. Both the significance of this one is that it's telling Lambda to look for a service name in the current folder before searching in the standard Bodo3 library, right? So the generate embed URL for registered user, that's a comparatively new API that we have released. And the older versions of Bodo3 wouldn't recognize that. So I have added a QuickSight folder within Lambda. And I'll show you once I save out of this and go back to the code block. So that definition has the generate embed URL API in it. So we are just forcing Lambda to use that version of QuickSight rather than looking at Lambda's own Boto 3 variant and then hitting an error if that's an older version. Lambda is usually on a delayed cycle when it comes to Boto 3. So with this, let's click on save. And you should see those environment variables all show up. You should have 5 environment variables here. With that, if you flip back onto the code section, you'll see there is a QuickSight folder in here with the model files in there, right? So that's what I was referring to by specifying AWS data path as dot. When we say, when we are looking for a Boto 3 QuickSight service, it will go against this version as opposed to the standard Boto 3 that comes with Lambda. Okay, so with that done, we are done with configuring the Lambda layer here. We will come back to this code block. We will go through it high level, see what it's doing. But for now, let's keep going. We'll complete the setup and see if it works. If we hit any trouble, we'll troubleshoot that, make it work, and then we will come back to this code block for a high-level walkthrough. So next step would be to create an API gateway component to go with this Lambda. So for that, let's open a new tab and therein launch AWS console again and search for API gateway and launch API gateway therein. Now, depending on whether you have already set up API gateway or not, you might see a different view. If you're creating it for the first time, you'll see a welcome page like this. The options should be the same, regardless of whether you're creating the very first one or you have already created. You should see these 4 options. Choose the REST API option from there. So click build on the REST API option. And if you're creating your first API, you will get a welcome message. Just click OK on it. And this is, again, a difference if you're doing it for the very first time. It drops you into an example API by default. Change that selection onto new API instead. And then for the API name, just type in QS embed sample, same as we did for other assets. Right, so the options here in this page are protocol is REST, API is new API, and then API name is QS embed sample. With that, go ahead and click the create API button. That will bring you to the API configuration screen. And in here, what we want to do first is create a resource. So from the center panel here in the actions button, if you click on it, you'll get a drop down and therein choose create resource. I'll hold it there for a few seconds for folks to catch up. And in here, let's type in the resource name as embed-sample. The resource path will automatically get filled with the same value. That's fine. All we want to type in is the resource name, embed-sample, and leave the other checkboxes as is, right? So do not enable API gateway course, just the default state is fine. And with that, click on create resource button. So all I did is plug in embed sample as the name, and I'm clicking create resource. Now you should see that embed sample getting added to that center panel. And with that highlighted, let's click the actions button again and choose to create a method. And from this drop-down box that gets added, choose the get method, and click the check icon that's next to it. So that will create the get method. And in the configuration screen for get, choose the integration type as Lambda. That's the default selection, so essentially leave it at default, Lambda function. Use Lambda proxy integration, check that box. This is important. We want to be able to have API gateway pass in the event details back to Lambda layer. So enable this checkbox where it says use Lambda proxy integration. And Lambda region, US East 1 is what I am working with. So whatever region you are working on, make that selection. And then under Lambda function, just start typing in QS embed and you select the QS embed sample Lambda function, which we created in the last step. So with that selected, we are good to save this. So I'll repeat the choices once more. Integration type is Lambda function. I checked the Lambda proxy integration checkbox, selected the correct region, and selected my QS embed sample Lambda function. With that, let's click on the Save button. You will get a permission dialog, which asks you if you're okay with giving permission for this API gateway to invoke your Lambda. We are okay with that, so let's go ahead and click this OK button. And now that get method is set up. With that, let's next deploy this. So let's select the slash from the center panel, the top node therein, and click on the actions drop down and say deploy API. On the deploy API dialog, let's choose the deployment stage as a new stage, and let's give a stage name as test or lowercase test, and click deploy. So right now it has deployed this API, and if you want to grab the full URL, if you expand the test twisty against test in the center panel and then click on the get method below there, you will get the full invoke URL in the center panel, which goes with the execute API region amazonaws.com/test/embed sample, right? So copy that full thing and let's paste that into our notepad as API gateway URL. Okay, and yeah, dashboard region, I'm using US East 1. Okay, so now that we have this URL, we are almost done with the setup. But remember, for the Cognito layer, we had put in a dummy URL when we started because we didn't have the API gateway URL quite yet. So now is the time to go back to Cognito and fix that. So let's go back to the Cognito user pool tab. Click on App Client Setting from under App Integration. And then instead of the HTTPS dummy, let's paste in this full API gateway URL, both in the callback URL as well as sign out URL. And make sure it's going all the way to /test/embed-sample. Once that's pasted in, be sure to click the Save Changes button down on that screen. Okay. So we are almost done with the setup. Just one final step wherein we have to allow list this URL in QuickSight. Okay. So for that, let's flip back to our QuickSight tab. And from the user menu, top right, let's open up the Manage QuickSight option. And from left panel in there, click on Domains and Embedding and paste in the URL, and just the URL part till.com. Remove the /test/embed sample. Just the execute API, US East 1, Amazon AWS.com, and click the add button therein. You should see that getting added. Now keep in mind that this is again a regional configuration that you're doing. So if you are embedding dashboards from US East 1, you should do this in US East 1. If you have dashboards from US East 2 to be embedded, then you should explicitly go into admin panel while in US East 2 and add that domain there as well. So it has to be done for all the regions from where you want to embed dashboards. Okay, so that's done. Now we are in good shape to try this out. So let's see if we can get this to work. We'll open a new tab. Therein I will paste the full URL and I'm going to hit enter. And it's loaded. So far so good. It redirected me to Cognito. So I can enter my username, which is demo user with a caps D, caps U, and enter my password. And it will ask me to change my password at this stage. So enter the password, repeat it, and then click the send button. And it accepted the password. It's redirecting me back to QuickSight. And at this point, it waited a little bit there. It was doing the user registration and adding the user to a group. It did all that setup on the fly for me here. And now it's giving me a message which says, share a dashboard with this user or the relevant embedded demo reader group in QuickSight, and then refresh this page. So before we go do that, let's also look at the embedded session view herein. So you can see I registered this user as a reader. So I am getting a full QuickSight session embedded here. And since this user is just a reader, just get to see favorites, reasons, recent, and dashboard. But if we had registered an author, then when we come to this view, we will see the full authoring options as well. So analysis, data sets, those options as well we'll see in this view. Okay. So with that, let's go back to QuickSight, and from samples, I'll publish a couple of sample dashboards here. So I'm just using the sample analysis and publishing this out as a dashboard. I'll call this my dashboard 1, publish it, and then I'll share it with embedded demo readers group. So this group got created when the user first logged in. The Lambda layer did this for me, and we will walk through that code in a little bit. So I'm going to just share it with this with your viewer permissions, and let me publish one more dashboard, maybe a different sample here. Okay, publish that and share this with the embedded demo reader group as well. And yeah, so that's done. I'll come back to this embedded page and I'll just refresh this. Let's see what happens. So now instead I get a different message which says, please select a dashboard to view. And if I click this drop down, I get these two choices, dashboard 1 and 2. If I select those, the dashboard loads for me here. Right? If I select dashboard 2, dashboard is loading for me here. Right? And if I go into embedded session view, those two dashboards, which I just now shared, now shows up in this view as well. So I could consume it from here too. So it's optional for us how we want to set this up. I'm showing you both the views here. So if you're more interested in getting a look and feel that's very closely matching your own parent application, then you can go with a combination of using the select dashboard API, search dashboard API, which gets you a list of dashboards for a particular user, and then pair it with the dashboard embedding that we did here. Or if you just want to quickly embed analytics and you don't care about the look and feel as much, then you can embed the full QuickSight session view, right? And then have it show up that way for your end users. Now, there is, I did mention about the capability to embed Q. So I will show that as well. Like I mentioned, this Q embedding is still in preview, so I can't quite do it on this account, this temp account that I have been building on. So I will flip over to my own AWS account and I will show you the similar setup there. First loaded into this kind of a view with just dashboard and session, and then I will show you how I can enable embedded Q bar therein. Okay, the code block provided here that we loaded into Lambda has all the required components, and we'll go over that. But let me first quickly show you Q embedding from my own account. So let me find out more on my account here. Give me just one moment. So, let's see. So in here, I want to go into API Gateway and search for this particular endpoint. Let's launch this. A similar setup. So it's asking me for the password and username password. Okay. So now that the password is entered, you can see that it's asking me to select a dashboard, same kind of view as we saw earlier, and with just the session view and the dashboard view. Now I'll show you how I will enable Q on here. And this is just on the embedding side of things. I'm not going to cover setting up Q on the enterprise account. This is just showing you how to enable this if your account is already set up for Q and it has been allow listed for Q embedding, then how to use this code block to turn that on, right? So 300 and so I have the same code block set up here, and under configuration, I can go into environment variables and just add a new environment variable here called Q display selection. And for that one, if it's not present, it by default is considered to be hide Q, so you don't have to explicitly say this. But if you want to turn that on, put in a value as show Q and save that. So now just making sure it's saved correctly. And if I flip back onto this and refresh this page, it should load a Q bar as well for me, along with the dashboard. So herein I can select my dashboard, and I also have this Q bar up top. I have shared only one Q topic with this Q bar, so only one shows up here. But if there are multiple Q topics shared, then those would all be showing up here. And then I can ask questions of Q and get answers. So natural language questions to Q and get those answers. So this will help you pair your dashboards, embedded dashboards, and an embedded Q bar side by side. Or if you just want to embed a Q bar into your own application, just have Q bar sitting on top, you could do that. So the code block gives you the insight into how to do that, right? Now that we saw that in action, let's flip back to the earlier setup. Let's look at the code block a little bit more in detail and do a quick code walkthrough. So in here, we have, I mentioned the QuickSight folder is for getting the latest model. So we have access to this generate API, generate embed URL for registered user API. And then under optional packages, we have some Lambda libraries. This is for the local validation of OpenID tokens. But in a regular flow, this is not needed. That's why it's marked as optional packages. And under contents folder, we have HTML file, which is the static HTML, which initially gets loaded onto the front-end screen. And then an AWS logo file has been included here. So let's start from the lambda function.py. That's what's open by default here. So what we are doing here is we will look at what's coming in on the query string parameter as this mode. So if there is no mode coming in, it's defaulted to static. If the other values we are expecting is get URL and get dashboard list. And if the mode is coming in as a blank or static, that's how it will be when you first access this URL from the browser. What this Lambda function will do is come here, and then it will get the API gateway URL. It will construct that from the details that's coming in the event. So event host and the request context and path. It will just construct that API gateway URL. We could very well add that as an environment variable as well, just trying to save that extra step in doing this. And then we will read in the HTML content, and thereafter we will replace the contents in there with, so the logo file we will put in, we will replace with contents of the logo in binary format. Then we will have API gateway URL replaced, cognito domain replaced, client ID and display selection replaced. Okay, and once that's done, we will return that to the front-end browser. So let's quickly take a look at this HTML file in which we are replacing these values. So I just opened that from the content folder herein, and you can see the top section where these placeholders are present. This is where we will be replacing content. And as part of this script, a couple of things to note. The script included here on line 68, this is the standard QuickSight embedding front-end SDK, which we will use to embed those dynamic embed URLs into divs within your HTML page. And this second section herein is interim or a temp version of this front-end JavaScript library for Q embedding. Now, if you are doing this at your end, if your account has been listed for Q embedding, do not use this URL. This could be taken down at any point. So if you are using it into your own application, be sure to host your own version, right? This original one will always be available. And when Q embedding goes to GA, this one itself will support that embedding of Q as well. This is just an interim state, and I have flagged that with adequate warning here. Now, what this does is once the HTML content is loaded, we will add a class to display parent as to whether we want to show Q or hide Q. And then that's coming in turn from the Lambda function environment variable setting. And then we make this call to get OpenID token. And therein, we are going to check whether there is an ID token available as part of the URL, or if not, then we will check if there is one available in a cookie on the browser. If neither is the case, then we will redirect to Cognito. So that's what's happening here. We will redirect to the Cognito page for the user to sign in, and then when they come back, they have the ID token, so they will be able to proceed further onto this get QuickSight info section. And the QuickSight info section, we make multiple calls. So we package in the OpenID token and a timestamp to dedupe each request into parameters. And then we are making AJAX calls. We are making 4 calls here. One to the get dashboard list. That's to drive this drop down up top with the list of dashboards that the user has got access to. And then we make subsequent calls to this get URL function with URL type as dashboard to get the embed URL for the dashboard. Then we make another AJAX call with the URL type as session for the embedded session. And then if we have configured to show Q, then we make one more call to get the Q embed URL, right? And once that's returned, and I'll show you the Lambda side of the code in a little bit, but once this comes back with the URLs to the front end, we call the embed QuickSight function herein and identify the container, the kind of asset we are embedding, and pass in the URL that's returned from API gateway. And that particular embed QuickSight function is a wrapper I have built here, and it's on top of the QuickSight embedding embed dashboard. So if you are trying to embed a dashboard, it calls QuickSight embedding embed dashboard, passes in the URL and the div where it needs to be embedded, and it gets embedded into that div as an iframe. If it's a session, we call the QuickSight embedding embed session with the URL. And if it's Q, then for right now, I'm calling a variant instead of QuickSight embedding. I just have it named as Q embedding, and that's what I'm calling. But once it becomes GA, the call that you'll make here would be QuickSight embedding dot embed session itself with the Q URL. And a couple of additional things with Q embedding is we need to pass in these additional parameters. We say whether Q is embedded, we set that to true, we set the max height that Q panel can use. And then if we want to manage the background for Q, dim all of the other areas, then we could bring up a backdrop. So this is optional. Whenever Q is active, if we want to dim the backdrop, we can make set up a open callback and close callback function. I've done that here, and I'm just having a backdrop show or hide based on those calls, right? So in here, when I'm clicking into Q, you can see that the background is getting dimmed, and if I click out of Q, then it becomes all bright. So that's based on those callbacks. And then The Lambda side of things, we'll quickly look at that as well. So in here, based on if the subsequent API calls that's coming in, when it's coming in as get URL or get dashboard list, we are invoking this get QuickSight response.handler, and that code is here. So in here, you can see at the bottom that when we come in here, we do some common things like getting the AWS account ID, getting the region from it, getting the dashboard region, the role ARN, and so on. And then we check what kind of validation we are doing. We didn't configure this parameter because this is an optional one. So when it's not found by default, we set the value to STS, and it will go use the STS assumed role with web identity to validate that OpenID token. And if we had set it to a local authentication mode, then it will bypass this step. We'll look at that in a little while. So in here, we make a call to this check token validity function. And if that's, let's actually flip over to that now and take a quick look. So in check token validity function, what we do is in the default mode where we are using STS, we just make a simple STS assume role with web identity call. We pass in the role ARN, which is the QSER role, the dummy role we created, and we pass in the session name as extracted from the token. We pass in the actual OpenID token that Cognito returned to us. And if the token is valid and hasn't been tampered with, STS will return success. And that's all we are looking at here. We are not using the credentials returned to make subsequent calls. We just return back value of true, which means that the code block can continue, the token is valid. Let's say if we didn't want to use STS and had set up that OTHval mode to a value of local and also configured the Cognito user pool ID, then we come into this else part of the flow, wherein we will first we'll construct this Cognito IDP URL and then go get the public key from the well-known jwks.json link in there. And using that key, we will use Python JOS library to validate that token. So the OpenID token has got 3 components, and I'm keeping this very high level. So it has a header which has like the algorithm used, and then it has a payload which has the username, the timestamp, expiry timestamp, and such. And then it has a signature, which is actually a combination of the header and payload encrypted with the private key. So what we are doing here in this verify step using the Python JOS library is that we are taking the decrypt the signature with the public key, and then we will compare that with the header and payload. And if that matches, then the token is valid, right? If it doesn't match, that means the token has been tampered with and it's not valid anymore, and we will not return a true value back, and we'll raise this exception. So either of these flows, the end result is we will get either a true out of it or an exception. And then, so in the bottom section here, if this comes back with a true, the token is valid, user identity is good, we can keep going forward. And therein, we next step, we identify the identity region, the region where the user is managed, and then we go on to evaluating the mode with which this API was called. If it's a get dashboard list, we call this get dashboard list function. If it was get URL, we call get URL function. And get dashboard list does a little bit more. So let's look at that first. So in the get dashboard list function, what we will first do is run the search dashboard function. So we are constructing the user ARN, and we are with that QuickSight user as the option for filtering. We call the search dashboard API. So if this user exists, this API will give back the list of dashboards that the user has got access to, and which is why I was able to get this list of 2 dashboards here that I shared with the group, right? And thereby gave access to the user. So very first time when we come here, the user hasn't been registered yet. So this is going to result in an exception. So we will go into this exception handling block, and from there we will call the function to register the user. So we will register the user using the register user API and register this user with the identity type as IAM. We are registering with the user role of reader, and then passing some additional identity provider type parameters here as well for added safety. This really doesn't matter because we are not assuming the role, but just for in terms of best practice, I am doing that here. Now, once the user is registered, we'll make a create group membership call, wherein we first create a group. If the group is not present, we will handle that here, create a group. That's the embedded demo readers group that was created. And then if the group is present, we add that user to the group. So we are using a little bit of recursion here. So first we are checking if we are directly trying adding the user to the group. Very first time the group is not present. So we hit that exception, we come handle that, and in that we create the group. And then we call the same function over again, right? Create group membership. So the second time round, when we come to create group membership, group is present, so all good. We are able to add the user to the group and control flow zone, right? So it's the same way here in the get dashboard listing as well. We were in this exception block. We added the user, and then we created group membership for the user. Then we are calling the same function recursively. And this time around, since the user is present, search dashboard goes through correctly and returns with the list of dashboards that the user has got access to. The very first time that came back with an empty list. So that's why the message came onto the screen saying, try sharing few dashboards with this user. Second time round, it came back with those 2 users. So I was given the message to select that dashboard instead. Now, in the get URL call, let's quickly look at that as well. So this is the block for the get URL call. So herein, we are first looking at the expiry timestamp for the token, and based on that, we derive the session duration to be used on this URL that we are generating, right? And then we are checking the URL type. So if it's of type dashboard, we are going to call the generate embed URL for registered user, pass in the account ID, the constructed user ARN, the derived lifetime in minutes. And like I showed in the very beginning from the CLI, the experience configuration is set to dashboard, initial dashboard. And here I'm starting it off with a non-existent dashboard ID, right? Because at this point, those calls were made in parallel. I'm making this call even before I know what dashboards this user have got access to. So I'm just passing in a dummy value, non-existent ID, and returning that URL. That URL, when embedded, would show an error message in the iframe saying that the dashboard was not found. And we didn't see that error message because that iframe was hidden under that loading layer. And then later that loading message changed to say, try sharing a dashboard with this user, right? Or later on, after we have shared it, it changed to please select a dashboard from the dropdown. So the error message is hidden underneath. And when the user makes that selection from the front end screen, picks a particular dashboard, at that point, now there is, it's very easy at this point. The iframe is already ready with an embedded dashboard, just that it's showing an error, but we just make a quick call to a front-end function, which is navigate to dashboard, and pass in the dashboard ID of the selection that the user made. And there is no backend calls needed. So it's very quick at this point. It's just switching the dashboard, and we don't see that error anymore. And we bring up that iframe to the visible layer, right? That's what's being done in the front end. Now, likewise, when we are calling in the parallel Ajax call for generating the session URL, it's the exact same API call if you see here, generate embed URL for registered user, but the experience configuration side is different. So instead of the dashboard, we are saying we want to get the QuickSight console, and the initial path, set it to start/favorites. Right? And then when we are making the call for queue, and again calling out, this is only for queue enabled accounts, and for right now, since queue embedding is in preview, if your queue embedding is allow listed for your account, then it's the same API call. Experience configuration is asking for QuickSight console. Just only difference is the initial path. We've set it to queue/search, and then it will give a searchable queue bar that we saw here. And with, if you have multiple topics set up, then those topics will be visible here for you to select from. Or if you want to pair a particular topic with a dashboard, then you can further add on to this and say queue/search/ the topic ID, which you could in turn pass in from the front end and have that URL be coded for that specific topic. So there is no option to select between topics, but you get opened into that one specific topic. Okay, so that's the high level on embedding. So bottom line, what I want you folks to take away from this is the core API involved is this generate embed URL for registered user, right? And like I showed you from the CLI at the very beginning, making a call to this is very easy because you're passing in the user ARN. So you have the full freedom to choose what kind of authentication, what kind of user integration you want to do. You could work with OpenID Connect, you could work with SAML, or you could work with your own homegrown solutions. All that matters is that your parent application or parent website knows for sure the user identity, right? And once you have that, you can construct the user ARN and use that in making the simple call and then get the embed URL back and embed it into your application. Everything else that we have built here is just in case you do not have a working application, you're getting started on embedding, you want to get your hands dirty and poke around, right? So we just build the framework for you using Cognito, using OpenID Connect, and using Lambda and API Gateway to serve as both your web server as well as application server. But this is just your trial bed, so play around in there and keep in mind that what's of core importance is just this API and calling it with the correct user ARN. So that's all the content I wanted to cover today.
Just like to thank Arun for the time for running this session. Hopefully the attendees were able to follow along and now have a good idea of how to embed QuickSight dashboards within their applications. I have shared in the chat the survey link for this session. We would appreciate if you would take a few minutes to provide your feedback. This will help us improve our further sessions. And also I have posted a link to our next week's webinar, which will be anonymous embedding. So please feel free to register for that as well. With that, thank you for your time, everyone. And we hope to see you in the future sessions as well. Thank you, Arun.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. Have a wonderful day ahead. Talk later. Bye.